You're watching WDFX TV, Fox 34, Dothan.
Hello, I'm Bob Rozewski. The subject for today is estate planning. Now, I know you're saying estate planning doesn't have anything to do with me. Estate planning is only for the elderly. It's only for the wealthy. Wrong. Estate planning is something that must be considered by anyone who really wants to establish a good, solid foundation for their overall personal financial matters. Let's talk about what is an estate. An estate is a legal entity that comes into being on the death of an individual, and it represents all that you own or all that is owed to you minus all that you owe. That's the financial side of an estate. An estate, as a legal entity in its own right, also has certain legal rights and obligations. Estate planning involves putting together all the financial and legal concerns regarding an estate so that you, while you're living, know that everything later is going to be handled just as you would have wanted it to. And you say, doesn't matter to me, I'm not going to be around to pay any attention or have any concern about it. Wrong. If you do the estate planning now, you'll have that much more peace of mind during your working and your retirement years, and you'll know that everything's going to be taken care of as you want it to be taken care of. For example, let's say that you've worked hard to accumulate however much wealth you may have. You don't have to be wealthy. It might be a modest amount. You want to make sure that that wealth is going to go to the people you want it to go to, don't you? You don't want it to go to somebody or someplace that you don't want to have it. I mean, after all, you've worked for it. It's your choice as to where it should go. And by the same token, if you have people dependent on you, let's say minor children or elderly parents or grandparents, you don't want some anonymous court to decide who's going to look out for their welfare. You want to be able to choose who's going to look out for their welfare. Those are elements of estate planning, and you have to do them while you can do them, because obviously if you don't, then it may be someday too late. We're going to talk about many of the aspects of estate planning, the intermix of legal and financial matters. We're going to talk about what your rights are, what your estate's rights are. We're going to talk about the people that are involved in estate planning. It's not just you. You have to call on other people to assist you, because of all the fields in the personal financial arena that do require some professional assistance, I would say estate planning is the one that probably requires more than any other. We're going to talk about the tools you can use to establish the estate plan that's right for you. There are a lot of different tools. Most people think in terms of a will being the only tool. It's not. There are others, though the will, of course, is the most predominant. And we're going to indicate how the laws differ from state to state. In the area of estate planning, there are 50 different sets of laws, 51 if you count the District of Columbia, and those laws are slightly different from state to state. There is no basic formula. There is no rule of thumb. They're slightly different, and you've got to know exactly what your own state laws are regarding estate planning. And the first and foremost law that you must be aware of is what's known as the law of intestacy. Intestacy is a situation that arises when one dies without having established a plan of distribution, such as a will, for their estate. And I want to give you some examples now of how the law of intestacy differs from state to state. For example, let's say that you die intestate, that is without a will or without having otherwise distributed your estate according to a plan, and you're survived by your spouse and children. Survived by spouse and children. In some states, the spouse will get 1/3 of your estate and the children will get 2/3 of your estate. And in some states, they'll split it 50-50, spouse 50, children 50. Now, if that's not the way you would have wanted your estate to have been distributed, then you have to get to see what your own state intestacy laws are. You have to make out your own will or other estate plan in order to do it the way you want it to do, not the way the state arbitrarily has designed that it'll be done. Now, don't worry if I'm not mentioning your state up here. I'm just trying to give you some examples. The ultimate point is that you must get to your own attorney and find out what your state situation is. Now, let's look at some other possible examples. Let's say that you are survived by your parents and a spouse, but no children. Parent or parents and spouse, but no children. In some states, the spouse will get everything, whether you would have wanted it that way or not. And in some states, the spouse and the surviving parent or parents will split 50-50. If that's not the way you would have wanted it to be, you've got to take the steps for the estate plan. Here's another example. Let's say you're survived by a spouse and siblings, brothers or sisters, however many there may be. Spouse and siblings, but no parents, no children, okay? In some states, the spouse will share with the siblings, and in some states, the spouse will get everything, whether you wanted it that way or not. When you die intestate, the state law determines, not your own wishes, whatever they may have been, unless you put them down in the proper fashion. And that's not all. In an intestacy situation, the court will appoint an administrator who is the person charged with overseeing the overall distribution and management of the estate, including the naming of guardians for small children or elderly parents or anybody else that may be under your guardianship. In other words, it's the court and not you that decides who will look out for those people. Is that the way you want it? Here's another way of looking at it. People say to me, do I need a will? I say, not necessarily, sort of joking, of course. Well, they say, I thought everybody should have a will. I said, no, not really. If you die without one, your state has created one for you. It's called the law of intestacy, and that will decide where everything will go that you've worked so hard for all your life. And if you don't like that will that the state has drawn for you, then you must take steps to change it. And that is what sound estate planning is really all about. What then are the elements that go into making a sound, sensible, and proper estate plan? First of all, you should know that if you follow the rules in setting up your will or other estate planning documents, the court in your state will protect your wishes until they are fully and totally carried out. Now, provided, of course, that those wishes are reasonable. Now, being unreasonable means the court may not carry out the wishes. What's unreasonable, for example? You can't leave everything to your pet cat and leave your spouse and children destitute. The court would deem that to be an unreasonable bequest. Or, for example, you can't demand that one of your children marry a certain party in order to receive an inheritance. Generally, that would be considered unreasonable. So, as long as you follow the rules, and we'll talk about some of those rules in a little bit, and as long as you are reasonable, then you can pass your wealth, your property, from one generation on to the next with the protection of the courts in your estate. Now, let's take a look at some of the people involved in estate planning. You're not the only one. There are other people involved, and I want you to understand the roles that they play because they can be fairly important. The people involved in estate planning, first we have the lawyer. And as I've mentioned to you before, if there's one area in personal finance in which professional assistance is really called for, it's estate planning. Estate planning can be complex depending on the size of the estate and the size of the family and the amount of wishes and directions and instructions you may have. And the more complex it is, the more you need a lawyer. A lawyer who specializes in estate planning is the proper person to assist you in making sure you have an estate plan that meets your needs. Now we have the testator. The testator is you when you have a will prepared. You are the testator. You are the person whose will it is. Upon your death, you then technically, legally become the decedent. You have died. You are now the decedent. You were the testator in creating the will. Upon death, you now are considered to be the decedent. Next, we have the beneficiary, and actually there's a number of classes of beneficiary, a beneficiary generally being one who receives something, a bequest from an estate. An example, I give my stamp collection outright to Susie to have and to hold forever, period. Susie is thus an outright beneficiary. Now, what if Susie should die before I do? Who would get the stamp collection? Well, I name a contingent beneficiary. I say, if Susie should die before I do, then the stamp collection shall go to Brenda. Brenda has thus been named a contingent beneficiary. She gets the stamp collection if and only if Susie dies before I do. Now, you can also have something that's known as a life estate. Here's an example. I give my summer cottage to my cousin Melba for as long as she lives, and upon her death it shall go to my nephew Oscar. I have given Melba a life estate in my cottage. She has it only for as long as she lives. She cannot pass it along in her will to anybody she wishes to, because on her death I have already deemed that it will go to Oscar. So Melba has a life estate, and Oscar then is the ultimate beneficiary upon Melba's death of that particular cottage. Next, we have the executor, a person who plays an extremely important role in an estate. An executor is the person that you name to see to it that all of the wishes are carried out, to execute all of the wishes that you have set forth in your will or similar document. And the executor carries a lot of responsibility, so you must see to it that you choose someone who is trustworthy and that you know will carry out those duties. An executor may need assistance from an attorney, from an accountant, and the executor has to be free to hire such professional assistance prudently when necessary. An executor may also serve with or without fee, that is pay, and you have to agree upon that with the executor. And the executor may also serve with or without bond. An executor's bond is a kind of an insurance policy that can be obtained to assure your survivors that the executor will carry out all the duties properly, and that if he doesn't, they can get some compensation through the insurance company through the bond that the executor has taken out. Next, we have the administrator. I've already mentioned that, and I just want to repeat it to compare it with the executor. The administrator, you'll remember, is a person that a court names in the event you die intestate without a will, a person that the court names to carry out all of the necessary functions of the estate. The executor is the person that you name to carry out all those functions. Who shall it be? Someone that an anonymous court names or someone that you name to carry out those functions? I think obviously you want someone that you name to be responsible to do those things, and thus you have to name the executor in your will or otherwise take care of the matter accordingly. Next is the probate judge. The probate court, as it's called in many states, comes by different names in other states. The probate court is the court wherein a will is proven to be valid, and it's the probate judge that makes that decision. Probate judge, if a will is challenged by an outside party, can, under certain circumstances, determine that a will is not valid, all of which leads you to say, follow the rules to make sure that your will is validly prepared. The probate court judge is the one that makes that ultimate determination, and obviously he plays a very important role in your overall estate planning. Now let's examine some of the tools you can use to build your estate plan. And let me point out, most importantly, that there is no rule of thumb that any or all of these devices might be right for you. It may be one of them. It may be a combination of them. You have to discuss the matter with your attorney and let him decide which single one or which combination of these different devices are best to build your estate plan to suit your needs and desires. First and most common tool that's used is a will. We've talked about it previously, and in a few minutes I'll go into some of the specific details that you should know about in creating a will. But a will is the most common device used to create an estate plan. Another device that many people might use is a trust. Let's say I want to pass on some money in the future to my son John when he reaches, say, 35 years of age. I go to a bank trust department and I say, here's the money. You keep it, you invest it for me in accordance with my wishes, and on John's 35th birthday, you give it to him. I have, in effect, in a small sense, created a trust agreement. The bank is acting as my trustee. They will follow my instructions, and they will deliver the money to John as I've instructed. Now, I could do this while I'm living. That would be called a living trust, or I could establish a trust in my will to take place upon my death, and that would be known as a testamentary trust. The next item that many people will use is making gifts. You can give gifts to people and thereby get rid of your estate, so to speak, as it suits you, as you wish to do. Don't give away more than you can afford because you may need some to live on, but gifting is one way that many people will use to pass their wealth from one generation to another. Another item is insurance. I'm speaking, of course, of life insurance. and people can use life insurance as a mode of transferring wealth from one generation to another, either a small part or a large part. And you should discuss your own life insurance portfolio with an insurance agent to determine the role it can play in your estate plan. I'm not necessarily recommending it or against it, just something to consider that you might find useful. The next item is joint ownership, and many people think that because they own their home or their savings account in joint name that they don't need any other estate planning to be done. Well, that may be the case in some instances, but I honestly can't say that it's the best way to go unless you've checked it out with your lawyer. It may be right, but let the lawyer decide what's right for you. Joint ownership, of course, means usually a husband and wife will own something jointly together, and then in the event of one's death, it all passes on to the survivor. Check it with the attorney to be sure to what extent it is right for you, to what extent it does fulfill all your needs and wishes in your own estate plan. Then, of course, spending it all. I mean, you can do that and not have to worry about an estate plan. There won't be an estate if you've spent it all. That might be more fun. If you don't have anybody that you care to leave anything to, spending it all isn't a bad way to go. Again, talk it over with your attorney before you decide on that plan, because you may spend it all too quickly and there may not be enough left after it's all gone and you still have many years to live. Now, let's take a look at wills, at some of the specific elements that go into a will. And I want to repeat, the law of wills can differ, even if only slightly, from one state to another. So you have to determine with your attorney's assistance what your laws are and follow them accordingly. Let's look at the elements in a will. The first is the introductory clause. The introductory clause is the one in which you state in whatever proper language that I, Bob Rozevsky, being of sound mind and body, or some similar words, do hereby declare this to be my last will and testament. I don't want to call it my shopping list or my Christmas list. I want everyone to know this is my will. I don't want there to be any mistake about as to what it is, because if it is mistaken as something else, then it may not be admitted into probate, and it may not, my wishes may not be followed. The next item is a revocation clause. A revocation clause should be used if you have had wills drawn previously and you want to revoke them. I hereby revoke any prior wills. You don't want there to be any mistake as to which one is valid, the old one or the new one. So a revocation clause is the proper way to take care of that. You then have a clause in which you call for your debts and final expenses to be paid for. That's customary. And then another clause, which is a fairly major one, in which the legacies and bequests, those are technical legal words for the inheritances you're passing on to people. You can be as specific as you like. You can, in some senses, be general. But this is primarily the part of the will in which the distribution is made, who gets what, in effect. And again, your lawyer's guidance is necessary in structuring the specific language of this. Then comes the another area in which you appoint whatever parties you must appoint to carry out certain wishes. If you wish to name a lawyer for the estate, you name an executor for the estate. If you have to name any guardians for small children or elderly dependent parents, you appoint them in the appointment clause, and you name them specifically, of course, and you should have gotten their consent before you name them, putting them in the will, because they will have duties to fulfill. And now comes the really most important aspect of the will, and that is the execution and the witnessing of the will. Your state law will set forth how many witnesses must be on hand to actually visually witness your signing of the will, and they must witness and sign themselves in order for the will to be properly valid. State laws differ, as I mentioned. Make sure your state law is followed in this, what can be intricate but very necessary procedure of properly executing the will. Now, there are some kinds of wills that are called uncommon, and pay attention to those because you really should avoid them if possible. One is a non-cupative will, as it's called, and that is a spoken will. And then there's a holographic will, which is a will written in your own handwriting. And most states will not allow such wills. A few states will allow them under extreme circumstances. So you will want to avoid that type of will preparation, because you might find, or your survivors might find in probate court, that they don't really meet the requirements. And that brings us to the next consideration in estate planning, probate. Probate is a procedure in which the validity of the will is proven in the court. Now, some of your property may have passed outside of the will, such as through insurance or gifts, for example, and that can avoid the probate proceedings, which can be costly. discuss in advance with your attorney what the probate proceedings amount to in terms of cost and time, and see to what extent you may want to pass property outside of the will, to what extent it's feasible. Now, once the will is admitted for probate, some people may come in and contest it. They may take issue with it. They may claim it's not valid, either in whole or in part. This is known as a will contest, and if those people who are contesting the will are successful, then one or more clauses or the entire will can be made invalid, in which case it could be thrown back into intestacy. In other words, it would be presumed that you died without a will and that the property would pass in accordance with your state laws of intestacy. And that means all the more, follow your lawyer's advice, follow the state laws, and you will minimize the chances of there being a will contest. Now, how can a will contest arise? Remember I mentioned earlier that you might give everything to your pet cat and cut off your spouse and your children? Well, if that was in your will, somebody would likely contest it, likely the spouse and the children, and say, this isn't valid, it's contrary to what's reasonable, and the probate judge would likely throw it out and take care of the wife and the children by other means. Or somebody may claim that you prepared and signed your will under duress, that somebody forced you to do it, twisted your arm and said, execute that will, giving everything to me and cutting off everybody else. Well, if those everybody else's can prove that that was the case, then the will can be thrown out accordingly as well. That's a will contest. Now, if the will is not contested, and if it is otherwise proved valid, then the judge will say, okay, you can start distributing everything that is to be distributed, and the executor will commence the duties of doing that distribution of whatever you've set forth in your will. Now, let's say you have a will, and some time goes by, and you decide you want to change the will. How do you go about changing it? Well, first let me tell you the way not to go about changing it. Don't get an eraser and rub out parts, or a pen and scratch out lines, or a pair of scissors and snip off the bottom of a page. Those are the wrong ways to change a will. Just as the original creation of the will must be done in strict accordance with state laws, so must any changes to the will, or the changes might be found to be invalid. And remember, when you do it according to the law, your wishes are protected. If you go outside the law, your wishes may not be protected. The common and most brief way of changing a will is through a document known as a codicil, C-O-D-I-C-I-L. That's a brief couple of paragraphs maybe that simply change the specific elements in the will that you want changed. And the codicil should be executed and witnessed and attached to the original will. If the changes are extensive enough, you may want to consider rewriting the will altogether, going from scratch. And if you do, as I noted earlier, make sure that in the new will you put in the revocation clause so that the old will is properly revoked, so there's no misunderstanding as to which of these specific wills are the one you really had in mind. Now, when should you change a will? There are a number of reasons why and when you should. And let me first point out that a will should be reviewed anyway, just under general principles, every 2 or 3 years, just to make sure it's still in line with what your wishes are. But there's some specific times when a will should be changed. For example, when you move to a new state. Remember, I've said that the laws on wills and estate distribution may differ slightly from state to state. If you move from one state to another where those laws are different, you want to make sure that your will and all of your other wishes in the will do conform to the laws of that new state. If there has been birth or death of any parties involved in the overall estate plan, you probably should change the will. For example, if someone that you have named as a beneficiary has died and you don't have a contingent beneficiary, you may want to change your will to name one. If you have 4 grandchildren and a 5th comes along, is born, you may want to amend the will to specifically include that grandchild, and so on. So anytime there's a birth or death in your family or in anybody's family that's dependent on your will, it's probably time to look at a change. If you've had a change in your assets, you may want to change your will. If you have gotten suddenly more wealthy or suddenly less wealthy, it may have a big bearing on who you want to get what and when. If you've had a change in your status, it would probably be advisable to review your will and perhaps change it. If you have gotten married, if you have become divorced, for example, those would be good indications for you to review and possibly amend your will. And most importantly, of course, if there is a change in the law that could affect the distribution of your estate, you then want to get to the will and see what changes might be necessary. It's not terribly likely that there will be major changes in the state laws of distribution and descent, but on the federal tax level, there could be some major changes. There have been in recent years. There could be again in years to come, which could affect how you want your property distributed, to whom and under what circumstances. In addition to some of these specific reasons for changing a will, you may have personal reasons of your own. And of course, if you do, take appropriate steps to make the changes that are necessary. Remembering all along, of course, that if a change in a will is needed, nobody else can do it for you. Nobody else will do it for you. A review of your will is necessary every couple of years. Nobody else can do it for you. Nobody else will do it for you. Take those steps to make sure your will constantly remains up to date. Now, I want to take a look at some of the right ways and the wrong ways of going about preparing a will and an overall estate plan. As I've noted, the right way is with a lawyer, particularly a lawyer who specializes in estate planning. If your family lawyer doesn't have the expertise needed, then ask him to recommend someone who does. He won't mind. A simple will is not an expensive proposition. Visit with a lawyer, explain what your assets are, explain what your wishes are, and let the lawyer determine the proper tools to use to build the estate plan that's right for you. And for goodness sakes, once you've had the lawyer prepare the will, make sure you go back and have it executed. So many people think that, gee, if I sign my will, lightning's going to strike me the next minute. And for that superstition, so many wills remain unsigned and so many estates get distributed in a way in which the testator would not have wanted it to have been distributed. The wrong ways, well, first of all, the store-bought will. Don't go to the store, which you can do, and buy a will form for $1 or $2 and fill in the blanks. Laws on wills are complex. If you fill in the blank wrong, you may be defeating the whole purpose. The store-bought will is not the way to go, nor is it to copy someone else's will. Even though you think that family has circumstances identical to yours, so if what's good for them is good for us, we'll just copy their will and save the lawyer fee. That can be dreadfully wrong because your overall desires and wishes and underlying legal circumstances could be decidedly different. And don't make it up from scratch. I mean, you really don't know what to do. From what I've told you, this is not an estate planning seminar. I'm just hitting the high spots to show you what the rights and wrongs are and to guide you to the lawyer that can help you do it right. In this program, we've talked about some of the basics. In the next program, we'll look at the specific objectives and how you can attain them. I'm Bob Rozewski. Thanks for watching.
This is PBS.
Thursday thrills with 2 all-new specials. First, it's intense, it's powerful.
Oh my God!
It's scary as chases and riots. Plus, they start out as good times
He fell.
and become the most terrifying accidents ever. Parental discretion advised when good times go bad, too. February thrills. Hell has no fury like a demon scorned.
I know you love Rosalind, or I'm going to become.
All new Brimstone. Then, a nanny with a dark secret.
I found something you're not going to believe.
Teaches a family the meaning of evil. Millennium.
Friday night at 7 on WDFX. You're watching WDFX TV, Fox 34, Ozark, Dothan.
Hello, I'm Bob Rozewski. You work hard all your life to acquire whatever wealth you're able to acquire. And you want to know with assurance that on your death, whatever wealth you have acquired will pass quickly and totally and efficiently to those people you want to have it. That's what estate planning is all about. And before you start saying, oh, I don't have to worry about estate planning till I'm much, much older, let me tell you the story of poor Joe, who had good intentions and worked hard, but it's kind of a horror story. When Joe was about 20 years old, he was going into the Army, and being conscientious, even though he had hardly a penny to his name at the time, he made out a will, and he left everything, whatever he had then or whatever he may later acquire, to his parents. He went into the Army, and he came out of the Army in good shape, and he went into business for himself. He married, he started raising a family, he bought a home and put the home in his own name. He didn't believe in life insurance, and he never acquired any life insurance. His business prospered, everything was going along very fine, until Joe was killed in an automobile accident in his early 40s. In spite of all the wealth that he thought he had, the family estate was left in a virtual shambles. I want to show you some of the numbers on Joe's situation so you'll know what I'm talking about. Joe had a will, as I mentioned, and he left everything to his parents. He never changed the will, so upon his death, technically speaking, his parents would get everything. His wife could have made an election against the will in accordance with the laws in her state. Widows generally have a right to elect against the will if they have not received a fair share of a given will. But that would have meant some court situations, and it was a fairly distasteful situation to get involved in. Joe's home was worth $150,000 after the mortgage. That was the equity in the home, and that's all well and good. But they didn't want to have to sell it because the wife and children still lived there. Joe had acquired stocks worth $175,000. That's what he paid for them. But unfortunately, over the years, his judgment proved bad, and upon his death, the stocks had a fair market value, FMV, fair market value of only $75,000. Joe's business was thriving when Joe was alive, and with Joe alive, they figured it was worth $350,000. That's what they could have sold it for. Joe's wife never partook in the business and didn't really have any notion about how to run the business, and without Joe there, the business may have been worth only $150,000, veritably just salvage value. There was nobody to run it, and in order to have it worth that $350,000, she would have had to pay somebody a very healthy sum of money to run the business. Joe had also bought some land adjacent to the building in which his business was, and the land, curiously enough, was of no value to anybody else other than the person that owned that building and ran the business. The land cost $50,000 originally, but without the business there to run it, the land may have been worth nothing. Really not quite sure. All of these things fell into a turmoil upon Joe's death. Here's what the final plight really looked like. Joe had thought he was worth about $725,000, a fair chunk of money. That's the business and the home and the land and the stocks and everything else like that. But his actual wealth at the time of his death was only $425,000. Still not too bad, but remember, they couldn't really sell the home. The stocks they would have had to sell at a loss, and the business they were just getting salvage value for. And all of these assets put together, regardless of what they were worth, were bringing in zero income, not a penny's worth of income to the wife and to the children. And on top of that, Uncle Sam came knocking at the door, the federal tax collector, and said, we estimate that you owe us $40,000 in estate taxes, and you've got to come up with it. Well, you can appreciate the widow's plight. Here, poor Joe had done his best to establish a good life for his family. Originally, he was conscientious in creating a will, but he didn't follow through. He had no liquidity in his estate. The distribution was all fouled up. He had to pay, or his estate had to pay, a huge chunk of taxes. Poor Joe. And don't think that can happen to you. Well, what are the proper objectives that Joe should have been looking at and that you should be looking at with regard to estate planning? First, liquidity and distribution. That means having assets that can readily be converted into cash to be distributed to those who need it. In Joe's case, obviously, there was very little liquidity because nothing could be sold without some kind of sacrifice, and the distribution scheme was all wrong because, remember, in his will he had left everything to his parents, and it would have been somewhat of a hassle to make sure it went properly to his wife and children. Next, asset management. That refers to the abilities of the survivors to properly manage whatever assets are left to them. In Joe's case, as I've noted, his wife didn't know about running the family business, so there would have been a serious deficiency in management. You want to be sure in setting out your estate plan that the assets will be properly managed. Next, minimizing taxes. I'm referring primarily to federal estate taxes. You may never have to worry about your estate paying federal estate taxes if the estate isn't large enough, but you won't know whether or not the estate is large enough to have to pay taxes until you've done the exercises that will instruct you whether you have to take evasive action in order to avoid having to pay taxes. Now, I'm going to refer in more detail to all of these objectives in a few moments, but first I just want to briefly recap some of the planning tools that you can use to structure your estate plan. First and most common is the will. Most people will have wills as the foundation of their estate plan, and the will, of course, can allow you to achieve all those objectives we've been talking about. The next item is trusts, and trusts are a way of giving money or property in the future. You can use a bank trust department, for example. You give them instructions, you give them the money or the property and say, here, I want you to invest it for me in line with my instructions, and at some future date, I want you to make sure that it goes to the people that I want it to go to. You can establish that while you're living, or you can have it established under your will. Trusts also, as well as wills, should be drawn up only with the assistance of an attorney, preferably an attorney who specializes in estate planning. Next, gifts. You can make gifts to as many people as you like. You may run into some federal gift taxes, but if you keep the amount of the gift under a certain level each year, then you can distribute a good portion of your estate through the making of gifts. Next is insurance, and many people will use life insurance as a means of distributing wealth that they've accumulated. It may or may not fit into your scheme of things. Talk to a life insurance agent to see just how it might suit you. Many people have property in joint ownership, that is jointly owned between husband and wife, where on the death of one, the other survivor automatically owns the property. That might work for you, but again, joint ownership is not necessarily the best way to do it. You really have to talk about it with your attorney and make sure that he is in accord with how you're doing things. Finally, of course, you can spend it all, and then there's no need really to worry about estate planning. Only problem is if you spend it too quickly and you still have some years to live, you could have some serious problems. Any one or any combination of these particular estate planning tools might be right for you. Discuss it all with your attorney so that you can structure the plan that will satisfy your needs long-term and short-term. Now I want to discuss with you, going back to the estate planning objectives we talked about earlier, the first on the list being liquidity and distribution. You must evaluate the needs of your survivors, both short-term and long-term, and bear in mind, of course, that those needs will change as the years go by. For example, at one time in your life, the needs of your survivors may include college tuition, if that's what you want for them, and after they're done with college, that's no longer a need. So you may want to divert funds that you had originally set aside for the tuition into some other channel. You have to evaluate the people that you will be distributing your estate to, and there's some tricky situations here. What would you want done if your spouse, for example, remarried? Do you want your children to share equally? What if one child marries somebody that's very wealthy, and that child will be well taken care of, and the other children aren't quite as fortunate, or unfortunate as the case may be, because wealth doesn't always spell happiness. But how would you want to alter the distribution in such an event? Consider those things and talk them over with your spouse. Asset evaluation is really the key to liquidity, because you have to determine what assets you have are readily converted into cash without undue sacrifice. Remember, in Joe's case, he would have had to, or his wife would have had to have sold the business at a very severe loss, or sold the stocks at a very severe loss. How are your assets? Are you able to sell them off without undue sacrifice? Are they readily convertible into cash? Will there be enough readily available quickly to take care of your survivors immediate needs. All of this has to do with liquidity and distribution. Evaluate it very carefully. The next category we want to look at is asset management. And one of the facts of life and death is that most married women will become widows for about 4 to 7 years on average. And many of these widows will be called upon to manage more assets than they've ever had to be concerned about before in their lives. And that can be a problem if they don't have the skills to do that kind of management. You must examine what the responsibilities of the survivors will be with respect to asset management. If your estate is large, if it is complex, the responsibilities can be many and varied and very challenging, and you may want to establish at the outset the proper professional help to help your survivors deal with those responsibilities. For example, if you have a lot of real estate, you may want to name someone to help them handle that for them. It can be very complicated. What are the capabilities of the survivors in dealing with asset management? Do they have the necessary skills and patience to do so properly? Because if they don't, you'll have to look at alternatives so that you can be assured that the assets will last them as long as you want them to and will not be wasted or squandered or poorly invested, leaving the survivors in dire straits long before the end of their lives. What are the alternatives you can consider? Well, two very simple ones, for example, are setting up trust funds that can arrange for periodic payouts to the survivors, or through your life insurance program, you may want to arrange for a long-term payout of the life insurance proceeds instead of a one lump sum payout. In other words, the life insurance company acts as a manager of the assets for you. Discuss this with your life insurance agent to determine the feasibility of doing so. Now, the third category of estate planning objectives is taxes. And let me first point out to you that state and federal laws, particularly in taxes, can change very quickly, so you must examine current laws in effect at the time you face any estate tax situation. There are three types of taxes that can come into effect on a person's death, bearing in mind, of course, that a person's estate takes his place when the person dies, the estate being all that the person owned and all that was owed to the person, less certain debts of the person. Now, at the federal level, the federal estate tax is levied on the taxable portion of an individual's estate, and the estate tax is paid before the estate is distributed to the individual survivors. The federal gift tax comes into play if you have made gifts over and above the amount allowed by the law. Those excess gifts fall into a taxable category in the same rates as does the estate itself. At the state level, there may be inheritance taxes. Those are taxes that are paid by those who receive an inheritance. And there may also be state estate taxes, which operate similar to the federal estate tax. That is, the estate pays the tax before distribution. A third category is income tax on an estate. Many estates may be a year or two in process before they're finally distributed, and they may be earning income while they're in that process, and if they do earn income, the income can be taxable. Now, I want to take you step by step through a simplified estate tax form to show you how the federal estate taxes do work. And here we have the case of Beulah and Beulah's gross estate. Beulah died in 1982, and at the time of her death, her total wealth subject to taxation was $380,000. Now, under the tax law, you were allowed certain deductions on the estate tax return. Those would include certain charitable contributions and burial expenses, among others. And in Beulah's case, the deductions came to $30,000. Subtracting that from the gross estate, you end up on line number 3 with what's known as the adjusted gross estate. Now, line 4 indicates the marital deduction, and this is one of the most important elements in overall estate tax planning. The marital deduction is the amount that one spouse can give to the other in proper legal fashion, and that amount given to the other spouse reduces the overall adjusted gross estate. In Beulah's case, she gave $50,000 to her husband. She could have given much more. In the year in which she died, she could have given everything to the husband, but for her own reasons, she chose not to. I just want to repeat, a marital deduction applies only between spouses. It does not apply from parent to child, etc., only from one spouse to another. Anyway, getting back to Beulah, she gave $50,000 to her husband, which brings us down to line 5, taxable transfers, as it's technically called, of $300,000. Taxable transfers being the word to describe the amount that is subject to the tentative tax. I know that sounds a little confusing, but follow me along, you'll see what I mean. In the year in which Beulah died, the tentative tax, line 6, on the $300,000 worth of transfers was $87,800, a pretty big chunk of change for an estate tax. But the U.S. tax laws stated that you are entitled to a credit against the tentative tax, and that credit is kind of an exemption, an equivalent to an exempt amount, so that some smaller estates don't have to pay any tax at all. The credit in that year was $62,800, and the credit subtracted from the tentative tax leaves with a final federal estate tax due of $25,000. So you had the tentative tax less the credit allowable, coming up with a final tax due of $25,000. Now, I want to explain that credit a little more fully, because tax laws that went into effect at the start of 1982 establish an ever-increasing amount of credit over the succeeding years, which means that each succeeding year an ever larger estate is exempt from the federal estate taxes. And here's the rundown as it was slated to begin in 1982 and years onward. For 1982, as I've already noted, the credit is $62,800. That means that a taxable transfer of as much as $225,000 would be exempt from federal estate taxes. That's the amount after the deductions, after the marital deduction. If that much was left in 1982, it would be totally exempt from federal estate taxes. 1983, the credit goes up to $79,300, which means that an estate of $275,000, after all deductions are taken out, would be totally exempt from federal estate taxes. And so it goes on up to 1986, 1987, and later. By 1987 and later, the credit is $192,800, which means that from 1987 and onward, subject to Congress's changing in mind, of course, an estate of as much as $600,000 after deductions, after the marital deduction, after all that's taken out, if there's as much as $600,000 left, it's exempt from the federal estate taxes. Now, Beulah could have taken some other steps to reduce her taxes, and one of them, for example, might have been by making gifts. Let's say that before she died, Beulah got very generous and decided to give gifts to all of her 16 beautiful little grandchildren, $5,000 apiece. Very, very nice. A total of $80,000 worth of gifts. Okay, remember, Beulah had a gross estate of $380,000. If she made those gifts totaling $80,000, she would have reduced her gross estate to $300,000, and then with the other deductions and the marital deduction, remember that was $50,000, would have lowered the whole estate so low that the tax would have been zero. In other words, by giving gifts to her grandchildren, or she could have given them to anybody for that matter, she, instead of sending money to Uncle Sam, the money stayed in her family. Instead of paying $25,000 to Washington, she gave $80,000 to her grandchildren. That's nice. That's a nice way to save on estate taxes, and anybody can do it. In 1982, the law went into effect, and again, subject to Congress changing its mind, of course, that can always happen. The amount of gifts that could be given without incurring any federal or estate or gift tax situation was $10,000 per recipient per year. In other words, you could give, if you had it and wanted to, you could give $10,000 per year to as many people as you wanted to without worrying about the federal estate or gift taxes. If your spouse joined with you in making that gift, the amount is $20,000 per year per recipient. Check what the estate and gift tax regulations are at the time you get involved in making any gift situations. And bear in mind, of course, if there's any excess over and above those limitations, if the gifts exceed those limitations, then the excess amount will be subject to filing a tax form and paying taxes. Now, another way that Beulah could have saved on her estate taxes would have been to give a larger marital deduction. Remember, in the original example, she gave $50,000 in the proper legal form to her husband. Let's assume she had given $125,000 to her husband. That would have lowered the gross estate from $380,000, again, down to such a low point, considering the other deductions that she had, that the tax would have ended up zero. So once again, instead of giving $25,000 to Uncle Sam's tax collector, she gives an extra $75,000, $125 instead of $50, to her husband, and everybody's much better off. Now, that brings up a curious situation, though. That is the marital deduction from one spouse to the other. And remember, I was saying that the marital deduction only applies from one spouse to another, not from parent to child, not from parent to niece or nephew, whatever the case may be, only from one spouse to the other spouse, entitles you to take that marital deduction and reduce the size of the estate so you can get it under a taxable situation. But, and here's the problem that can arise, particularly in larger estates, if the one spouse gives too much to the second spouse, then on the second spouse's death, there can be a big tax there if they don't qualify for a marital deduction. Let's see how this can work. For example, let's say you have a remarriage. Husband dies, leaves a lot of money to the widow. The widow remarries. Now, the widow decides when she's saying who's going to get what out of my estate, the widow decides that she's going to give a very large sum of money to her second husband. She can do that. As long as she is lawfully married, she can take advantage of that marital deduction that she has and give a big chunk to her second husband. But if there is no remarriage, there is no marital deduction. Husband dies, gives a big chunk of money to the surviving widow. She does not remarry. She doesn't spend or otherwise dispose of her inheritance. On her death, she can't take a marital deduction. She has no spouse to whom to give the money. And Uncle Sam's going to swoop in on that second estate and take a big tax bite out of it. As I said, if she hadn't otherwise distributed or spent it in proper legal fashion, the tax bite's going to be big on that second estate. Let's look at some numbers to see how that second estate tax can work with the case of Charlie and Mrs. Charlie. Charlie's adjusted gross estate, as you can see, is $500,000. Remember, of course, his gross estate would have been more than that. He would have been entitled to certain deductions. He ends up, as I mentioned, with an adjusted gross estate of $500,000. He decides how much he wants to give to Mrs. Charlie. A lot, a little. He wants her, of course, to be able to live comfortably. He will give her a marital deduction in the amount of $400,000, and the balance he will give to his children. You subtract the 400 from the 500, and you end up with taxable transfers in accordance with the formula I showed you earlier of $100,000, which, of course, is below the exempt amount. So the tax on Charlie's estate, the federal estate tax on Charlie's estate, is zero. And Charlie is proud of himself for having done this financial planning. He ends up without there having to be any federal estate tax on his estate. Okay, now what happens with Mrs. Charlie's estate, assuming she does not remarry, and also assuming, as can happen, that she is a prudent investor. She invests the $400,000 wisely, and she's able to live very comfortably off the income from that $400,000, leaving her with an adjusted gross estate of the whole $400,000. Well, that's very nice for Uncle Sam's tax collector because she has no marital deduction. Remember, I said she did not remarry. She has no spouse to whom to leave any of her own inheritance, her own wealth. So with no marital deduction for Mrs. Charlie, she is left with taxable transfers of $400,000. And for the year in which she died, that leaves her with a tax after the credit is applied of $59,000. So you see, all of the careful planning that Charlie had done for his estate didn't adequately take into account the tax that could accrue on his wife's estate upon her death, assuming she didn't remarry, and assuming, as I mentioned, that she did not dip into the capital, that she had it all remaining upon her death. Now, I've given you an oversimplified version of this rather, what could be rather complicated estate planning and estate tax matters. I just really wanted to give you the basic formula, the basic kind of thinking that you should pursue with your own professional advisors, so you know what questions to ask and you know what problems might arise and how you can go about solving them. Now, talking about professional advisors, that brings us to a very important group of people that I want to talk briefly about. I call them the fail-safe team. These are the people, as with so many of your other personal financial matters, particularly with estate planning and especially with regard to potential estate taxes, the people that you want to be in touch with. They are the professionals, the fail-safe professionals who stand between you and what could be financial disaster. Who are they? First, financial. The banker, the trust department officer who can talk to you about arranging any trust matters that might be needed or suitable for your particular estate. Accounting is very important. As you just noticed, I've gone through quite a bit of accounting type numbers, tax type numbers. An accountant is a person that you definitely should be in touch with for you to determine whether or not your estate does fall into a taxable situation and what steps you can take to minimize those taxes. The life insurance agent is certainly an important member of the fail-safe team. You should talk to the insurance agent to determine to what extent a life insurance plan can fit into your overall program in order to achieve your objectives. And, of course, the lawyer, a very important member of the team, who really should be handling all the documentation at the very outset and following it through to a sensible conclusion. Achieving your estate objectives takes time, takes work. If you see to it, you can get it done. You can protect your future and your family's future and have peace of mind as well. I'm Bob Rozewski. Thanks for watching.
This is PBS.
Dear lady in waiting, looking for a sensitive man,
Well, you know I feel naked without my tool belt.
powerful man.
Overton Jones has more pull than the elastic on a fat lady's draw.
I got what it takes to fix your broken heart.
Expert handyman will service your needs.
So call Overton and you can get the job done.
Living Single, now delivered 5 days a week.
Weekdays at 5:30 on WDFX.
Oh, and if your toilet's clogged, and I'm your man.
Need to see a psychiatrist? Experiencing anxiety?
What is the matter with you?
I have got
Uncontrollable outbursts? Unusual sexual urges?
You're the only man I've ever loved.
So are you.
Well, luckily, the doctor is in.
They like me. They really like me.
Get psyched for Frasier 5 times a week.
Weeknights at 10 on WDFX.
We're mad about you,
How romantic.
just mad about you.
Tell me it's true.
It's a sure bet she's as good as it gets. I'm mad about you. So make a date with your TV.
Oh, my God.
'Cause Helen Hunt's the girl you should see on Mad About You.
Maybe.
Weekdays it's true. Watch Mad About You.
Weeknights at 9:30 on WDFX Fox 34.
Funding for this program was provided by the Annenberg CPB project.
It was a time of war and civil war, revolts in the towns, heresies within the church. A time full of bitter conflicts at home and abroad, when men began to take their fate into their own hands. The late Middle Ages, this time on the Western tradition.
UCLA professor Eugen Weber's continuing journey through the history of Western civilization.
We are now in the 14th and 15th centuries, better known as the late Middle Ages. It's a time of change, of new economies, new powers, and the shaping of a new kind of state. On the other hand, it's also full of the same old horror. Endless wars, grinding poverty, deadly plagues. You can call it a time of transition, but all times are times of transition. You can say it's increasingly dynamic, but you wouldn't want to live there. Peasants still accounted for 80 to 90% of the population, and they would continue to do so into the 19th century. Nobles and clergy were still rich and powerful, and they would continue to be so for a long time. But trade and the rise of the town had brought basic changes to Europe. Burghers, merchants, city folk in general had introduced the novelties of money, economy, capital, investments, the notions of time and profit and wage labor, and new social divisions and new social tensions came with them. The old society of feudal orders, presumably willed by God, was breaking down. Worse, it was tearing itself apart in wars and civil strife. For example, the long struggle for supremacy between Italian popes and German emperors was weakening the emperors who wasted their energy in foreign conflict when they should have been tending to troubles at home. Words like German and Germany are simply shorthand. The reality was 240 states, hundreds of semi-independent feudal lords, dozens of tough, active towns from the Baltic to the North Sea and along the Rhine and the Danube valleys, as well as the territories of the House of Habsburg in Bohemia and Austria, and few of them got along. In the 14th century, the spotlight turns to France. Here was yet another devastating conflict, the 100 Years' War, which lasted even longer than its name, from 1337 to 1453, with very few interruptions. The war was a struggle of succession to the French crown, and it was waged between English and French contenders, but also between factions supporting great feudal clans all over France, but especially in Burgundy and Flanders. When the English were finally driven out of France, the country was in ruins. Wolves roamed abandoned villages, orchards, and fields, and worse than wolves were the bands of mercenaries that scoured the countryside for scarce provisions. Untilled lands returned to forest, scrub, or marsh. By the end of the war in mid-15th century, the French population was 1/3 to 1/2 what it had been 150 years before. But it wasn't all the fault of the English. For 200 years after 1348, the Black Death killed off more people than any fighting could have, as much as half the population in certain places. The figure in the center of this French mural represents death by plague, not war. It's a chilling fact that the number of French homes in 1789 was only 10% greater than it had been in 1328. What was equally bad, the costs of war ate up resources that could have been put to productive use. If you forge swords, you cannot forge plowshares. If you build castles and fortifications, you can't build mills or bridges or roads or rebuild the ones that are being destroyed. And it's not just material goods that are being destroyed. As the fighting drags on, the feudal order itself begins to crack. Feudalism in the first place was about military service. But short service feudal levies were not much use in an endless war. And so armies became more permanent and more professional. The more specialized the soldiers and their armament, and incidentally this is the time when artillery appears, the more money you need for them. The more the crown pressed to introduce taxes, which also strain the fabric of society because they are not part of any feudal contract, which is about an exchange of goods and services. Monarchies like those in England and France survived this time of troubles by learning to manipulate their aristocracies and, as far as possible, to enlist them in their service. New taxes, which only commoners paid, provided funding for royal patronage that attracted nobles and won them over to the interest of the crown. Of course, taxes also strained the economy further. In the midst of misery and conflict, the conspicuous consumption of the great grew ever more conspicuous. There were costly and vivid garments. There were women's hats so tall that in 1418 the doors of a royal castle in France had to be heightened to allow the queen and her ladies to pass, and this during the worst of the fighting. In spite of such folly, the French managed to drive out the English by 1453, except for one last English outpost at Calais. But this great victory for France was overshadowed that very year by an even greater defeat for the tail end of an empire, Byzantium. At dusk on May the 29th, 1453, the people of Constantinople made for the walls of the city, crying to the Virgin Mary for aid. Besieged for 50 days by 160,000 Turks, they didn't have enough men left to man the long walls and to mend the breaches made by 130 cannon and a fleet of 250 ships. 1 hour after midnight, the Turkish assault began. By noon of May the 30th, Byzantium was dead after more than 1,000 years. In the West, however, its fall had already been discounted. Europe had other fish to fry. The English were busy in the last half of the 15th century with a civil war of their own. another war of succession. It was poetically called the War of the Roses because the emblems of the two parties fighting for the crown were a white rose for the House of York and a red rose for the House of Lancaster. It's a long, dreary tale of murder, slaughter, battles, betrayals, ending in 1485 when the last surviving claimant of the Lancaster line, Henry Tudor, won the Battle of Bosworth and became Henry VII. The only good thing about the war, whose only relationship to roses were the thorns, was that the belligerent aristocracy was nearly decimated. 1/5 of the land in England was left without a master, and Henry VII reclaimed it as a royal domain, which increased the power of the crown at the expense of the feudal lords. Finally, by the end of the 15th century, Europe began to recover from nearly 200 years of war and plague. Devastated lands were restored, new lands were brought under cultivation, and the cities flourished once again. Small ones like Basel, with 8,000 to 9,000 people, middling ones like Nuremberg, with 25,000, great ones like Cologne, Bruges, around 50,000, Ghent, and in Italy, the giants, Milan, Florence, Venice, with between 75,000 and 100,000 people each. What the wars of the 14th and 15th centuries had started by killing off the nobility and strengthening the kings, these cities were going to continue. Because now a new dynamic social group made its appearance that was profoundly anti-feudal, the middle class. Towns and cities had declined as economy and security declined in the 14th century. In the 16th century, they make a comeback, and newly prosperous townsmen start to assert themselves. In Italy and Germany, where central government was weak or non-existent, they set up what become virtual city-states. In England, and to a lesser degree in France, they become the allies of the crown against the feudal aristocracy. Urban elites don't just make money. They move into positions of power by going into royal administration, where they can manipulate patronage. Furthermore, as they increase in number, as trade and the money economy grow, the life of the countryside was affected as well. Urban demands for food and raw materials made it possible for country folk to farm for profit above mere subsistence. Rising prices and a more plentiful supply of money also gave the peasant the means to buy his freedom or to commute his labor services for a money rent, or to take off for the cities where, as the saying went, city air makes free. Many things that happened in this period and beyond, including the Renaissance and the Reformation, were symptoms of the development of the urban middle class. It was in the 1300s and the 1400s that ordinary families were endowed with surnames which afforded them a new kind of personality. It was also in this period that more men of low birth began to win recognition and power. And the best example of this is the great Italian war leaders of the 14th and 15th centuries, the condottieri. This is Francesco Sforza, whose family ruled Milan. His father was a farmer. Sir John Hawkwood was the son of a tanner. He became Captain General of Florence. He married the daughter of a duke. Erasmo Gattamelata and Bartolomeo Colleoni were commoners who became generals of Venice. statues of this sort had until then been reserved for Roman emperors, but now commoners could aspire to the honors of kings. Even more significant were the rich burghers who began competing with feudal lords for rank and title. This is Dick Whittington, who made a fortune and became Sir Richard Whittington, Lord Mayor of London. From that time on, knighthoods in England could be won in the counting house. And after 1500, by Tudor times, all the great ministers, like Thomas Cromwell, William Cecil, and their descendants sprang from the new middle classes, not from the feudal nobility. The point here is not that new men came to the fore, because new men are always coming to the fore, and every age is full of newly rich or newly noble people who bring in vulgarity and dynamism and good strong teeth and sharp elbows. The point is the way in which these new men came to the fore, the class they represented, and the values for which they stood. Because now, instead of making your fortune by the horse and the sword, you made it by gold and credit and trading enterprise. And it was no longer the knight who wandered the country, but increasingly the laborer, the apprentice in search of work, now that the feudal order had broken down. And with labor increasingly mobile, employers found the cheap hands with which the great capitalist fortunes of the 15th century were put together. Financial speculation also came into vogue. We read of a dealer in the 14th century who spread a false rumor of war in order to send down the price of wool. And there were endless complaints about engrossing, buying up a whole stock in order to get a monopoly. The respectable grocers of today are the descendants of those engrossers. Men also began to speculate in real estate, which hadn't been done since the fall of Rome, and to accumulate farms and to substitute large-scale farming for piecemeal agriculture. Where sheep farming was more profitable than food growing, they would put the land to grass, where acres and acres of grazing could be looked after by a few men and a dog. The tenants were then thrown off the land to increase the great and growing army of potential workers, soldiers, vagrants, and criminals. So, as the saying went, sheep ate men instead of the other way round. Or, more to the point, men ate each other more voraciously and more ruthlessly than they ever did before. In these processes, we can recognize both the appearance of something like a capitalist economy and the passing away of the Middle Ages. The important thing about this change was not whether it was for the better or for the worse, but that it was change, and that it brought into question an immemorial feudal order which people had not thought to question before. Evils that were accepted before were now resented, and resentments that were silent became vocal. In a world where personal fate was no longer graven in stone, the poor were now held responsible for their poverty, and the poor in turn held others responsible, and so Europe entered the age of social conflict. The 14th century especially was full of rebellions. Workers against employers, small business against big business, peasants against lords, everybody against taxes and tax collectors. The most serious revolts were in the towns, because that was where you found a critical mass ready for anything. And it was also where social revolt acquired ideological overtones and turned into heresy against the established teachings of the medieval church. Rebellion was bad enough, but heresy was worse. Unfortunately, the right to expression in Europe was recognized less often than the right to repression. So heresy was often fatal for the heretics, especially when it took the form of a revolt of the poor against authority. To cope with heresy, as well as with poverty, the church responded by founding new monastic orders, notably the Franciscans, who took the side of the poor, and the Dominicans, who very quickly took the side against the poor. St. Francis, who lived from 1182 to 1226, was the founder of the Franciscan order. The son of a rich Italian merchant, Francis was something of a playboy in his youth, and when he got religion, his preaching reflected this. It was full of chivalric notions right out of the troubadours. He wooed my lady poverty. He made friends with the animals as if he lived in a fairy tale. His tone was good-humored and popular, and so were his followers. The founder of the Dominicans was Saint Dominic, who lived from 1170 to 1221. He was a Castilian nobleman, much more sober and austere than Francis, and not playful at all. He was interested in education and spiritual conformity and intellectual conformity. In the 13th century, when inquisitors were appointed to investigate heresy and stamp it out, most of the inquisitors were Dominicans. A Florentine Dominican named Savonarola was probably the most typical successor of Saint Dominic in spirit. In 1494, he established a puritanical theocracy in Florence, and he ended up burnt at the stake 4 years later by the very people who had cheered him on. Perhaps the greatest Dominican, however, was one of the most atypical. Aquinas, St. Thomas Aquinas, who died in 1274. Aquinas was less a preacher and more a philosopher who reconciled reason and faith. According to Aquinas, our understanding of God's will did not depend on some miraculous revelation. Rather, God made man reasonable so that he could analyze and handle nature. God also made man free so he could operate within nature and within secular society to the greater glory of God. You can see how well this fitted an age that was still deeply religious, but one in which men were beginning to take their fate into their own hands. But this age was also the age of strife between Pope and Emperor, between religious and secular power. And ironically, it was Aquinas, the great Catholic theologian, who provided a solid intellectual foundation for a state that was secular and rational, where princes administered a justice that was not purely arbitrary, but based on logical, predictable, codified procedures, as in the Roman law that the 12th century was rediscovering in the new university. Aquinas laid down as a principle that human right was not destroyed by divine right. The Pope was God's vicar on earth, and the Church was preeminent in spiritual matters, but in matters of civil good, It was better to obey secular power than spiritual power. And furthermore, law and justice, which Aquinas saw as part of the reason of God, were accessible to us simply by using our own human reason. And this in turn meant that law and justice were accessible to all reasoning men, whether Christian or pagan. If you want to press the argument, the light of reason did not depend on the church. It shined over all humanity, and all humanity was part of the same community. Now, today, we tend to see this as a cliché, but this community of man was potentially a very subversive thought in an age of rigid social distinctions, as we shall see in our next program.
Funding for this program was provided by the Annenberg CPB project.
For information about the Western Tradition television course, transcripts, pre-recorded video cassettes, off-air taping, or related books based on the television series, viewers should call the Annenberg CPB project's 1-800-LEARNER telephone number, or write to the Annenberg CPB project, 1111 16th Street Northwest, Washington, D.C. 20036.
Dear lady in waiting, looking for a sensitive man?
Girl, you know I feel naked without my tool belt.
Powerful man?
Overton Jones has more pull than the elastic on a fat lady's draw.
I got what it takes to fix your broken heart.
Expert handyman will service your needs.
So call Overton and you can get the job done.
Living Single, now delivered 5 days a week.
Weekdays at 5:30 on WDFX.
Oh, and if your toilet's clogged, and I'm your man.
Need to see a psychiatrist? Experiencing anxiety?
What is the matter with you?
I have got
Uncontrollable outbursts? Unusual sexual urges?
You're the only man I've ever loved.
So are you.
Well, luckily, the doctor is in.
They like me. They really like me.
Get psyched for Frasier 5 times a week.
Weeknights at 10 on WDFX.
We're mad about you.
How romantic.
Just mad about you.
Tell me it's true.
It's a sure bet she's as good as it gets. I'm mad about you. So make a date with your TV.
Oh, my God.
'Cause Helen Hunt's the girl you should see on Mad About You.
Maybe.
Weekdays it's true. Watch Mad About You.
Weeknights at 9:30 on WDFX Fox 34.
Seinfeld has the hairstyle that's right for you.
I got a haircut.
Can I see it?
Something distinctive. Or something completely different.
You fixed me up with a bald woman.
You're rejecting somebody because they're bald.
So?
You're bald!
For hair-raising comedy 6 days a week, make an appointment with Seinfeld.
Funding for this program was provided by the Annenberg CPB project.
Internal conflicts, foreign wars helped to break down the feudal order. Terrified of anarchy and sick of it, people turned to new images of stability. The central authority of the crown, the organized state, and a new era of organized violence began. The national monarchies, this time on the Western tradition.
UCLA Professor Eugen Weber's continuing journey through the history of Western civilization.
Last time we ended with St. Thomas Aquinas, the great Catholic theologian of the 13th century, who argued that all men, Christian and pagan, basked in the light of God's reason and were all part of the same community. But a disciple of Aquinas, a Florentine, known by the name of Dante, was going to take this one step further. For Dante, who was profoundly Catholic, the ideal unity under God was not the church, but humanity. And of this, the Roman Empire was the predestined servant and instrument. In Dante's eyes, the state had a providential mission toward the human race, a mission that was the same in the natural order as the mission of the church was in the spiritual order. This exaltation of the state was almost unique in medieval literature, but it was significant because it looked forward to the Renaissance, to the national monarchies, and to the new humanist culture that would supplant the old order of the Middle Ages. Dante, who lived from 1265 to 1321, was a genius. He was a great poet whose greatest work was a long poem called the Divine Comedy. He was a great dreamer, profoundly affected both by Christian tradition and by the Latin classics. But he was also a typical Florentine bourgeois, deeply involved in local politics and profoundly hostile to the Pope. He spent much of his life as a political exile and as a critic of much that he saw around him. It's sometimes difficult to remember that the rise of the middle class, which Dante in this case represented, the rise of the middle class introduced a factor of great instability in a previously stable society. The activities and claims of the middle classes reverberated at all levels of society, rendering the aristocracy insecure, turning city governments upside down, setting the peasants on the move, even permitting the large-scale wars of the period, especially the 100 Years' War, by finding new ways to finance them. By the 15th century, the old order was in a state of liquidation, and the problem was how to keep society afloat. Every great medieval institution had gone under or was going under. Feudal chivalry was falling before archers and infantry. Feudal castles were falling to gunpowder and artillery. The massive monuments of the feudal age were crumbling.
The Holy Roman Empire became a federation of German states with the emperor as its president. The popes exiled to their palace in Avignon functioned as echoes of the French king's will. And then, when they returned to Rome, the papacy was torn by factions supporting rival popes. This great schism, as it was called, lasted another 40 years. From 1378 to 1417, as many as 3 popes at one time contended for the support and the contributions of the faithful, and the papacy lost much of its prestige. As industry and commerce grew, they undermined the social system which was based on landholding. The rising middle classes and the rising cities sapped the power of the feudal barons. Rent was being substituted for service, and the serfs were being emancipated so that the land could be sold for money, or so that their manpower could be used in other enterprises. And all of this broke down the old self-sufficient manorial system. Everywhere there was change, everywhere there was disorder, everywhere the old ways were being challenged or replaced by new ones, and this universal welter seemed to carry a menace of anarchy. That was what people were most afraid of. No clear social or moral order, just a struggle for power with no holds barred. A situation in which, as Shakespeare describes it in Troilus and Cressida, there would be no justice and no right or wrong. Force would be right. Then everything includes itself in power, power into will, will into appetite, and appetite a universal wolf, so doubly seconded with will and power, must make perforce a universal prey and last eat up himself. It was because they were afraid of anarchy, and indeed had very good reason to be so. It was because of this that people turned to the central power which presented the very essence of order, the national monarchy. Kings had already reduced the Holy Roman Emperor, who was their nominal lord, to a shadow. Now they turned against the power of their nominal subordinates, the feudal lords. The struggle between the central authority of the crown and the disruptive, decentralized forces of feudalism was going to end at last in the crown's triumph. And the internal unity imposed by the king was then going to prepare the way for external expansion. France was first in the field. Jeanne d'Arc, Joan of Arc, was the inspirer and the patron saint of this outburst of French patriotism produced by the misery and the humiliation of the 100 Years' War. The daughter of a well-to-do peasant family, Joan believed she heard voices from angels and God who told her to rally her fellow French and drive out the English. Her martyrdom in 1431 at the hands of an ecclesiastical tribunal in English-controlled Rouen made her an even more powerful symbol of French resistance. By the second half of the 15th century, the war with England was over, feudal divisions were being mastered, and the foundations were laid for a national army and a national system of finance. It was then up to Louis XI in the second half of the 15th century to consolidate the monarchy as the core of a centralized state. After Louis XI and after his successor, Louis XII, the remnants of feudal independence were crushed and France began to expand at the cost of weaker neighbors. Province after province was incorporated into the French monarchy, and before the end of the 15th century, the strength of the new formed nation was going to push across the Alps and into Italy. Meanwhile, other states were following the French example. Ferdinand of Aragon married Isabel of Castile, drove the Moors out of Andalusia, and founded the modern Kingdom of Spain. Before long, Spain would also be pushing outside her borders over the Atlantic into America and over the Mediterranean to challenge the French in Italy. In England, after 1495, Henry VII was going to bring peace and order to the country, while on the other side of Europe, a series of marriages was creating another power. Maximilian of Austria married the heiress of Burgundy in the 15th century and united the Netherlands with Austria. His son, the Archduke Philip, married the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabel of Spain, and their two sons were Charles V, Emperor of the Spanish Empire, and Ferdinand I, who married the daughter of the King of Hungary and Bohemia and founded the Austro-Hungarian monarchy. A lot of family details that probably bore you, but that set the basis, the structure of European politics for the next few hundred years. And so, as the 15th century turned to the 16th, the political system of Europe was roughly sketched out, although the boundaries of the rival kingdoms were still undetermined, and there remained minor principalities and powers, especially in Germany and Italy, which offered an easy prey to their ambitious neighbors. In Germany, the king was also emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, which extended over hundreds of independent principalities and duchies. So he could only attain his office by agreeing not to enforce his authority, and the empire, in effect, was the tomb of German national unity. The unity of Italy, meanwhile, was prohibited not only by the rival ambitions of its cities and princes, but also by the position of the popes. This is Leo X, who became Pope in 1513. Leo and his successors could not tolerate a secular rival in the peninsula, and although the papacy was never strong enough or durable enough to unite Italy itself, it was always influential enough to keep anyone else from doing it, even if that meant calling in outsiders to help. And so Italy, like Germany, was ruled out of the national race and had to wait 300 years for the national consolidation which its rivals achieved by the 16th century. Now, this period was also a time of more contact between states as political and territorial definition grew. And this increased contact, in turn, led to the development of new political forms to handle it. Squatters, isolated on a large plain, have little need for organized communication, but when they stake out their claims right up to their neighbor's property, they see each other more often, they watch each other more closely, they tend to fight. And that's what happened with the national states. Before the era of national expansion, diplomatic relations had been rare and spasmodic, and ambassadors were only dispatched on special occasions. But during
the 15th and the 16th centuries, ambassadors became regular and resident. These two French ambassadors were painted in 1533, and while the modern diplomatic system was growing out of the necessity of countries busy watching each other, modern international law was growing out of the need to adjust the increasing number of international disputes. And out of the calculations based on each state's jealousy of the other's growth, the idea of the balance of power grew as well. There were other changes. As the area over which the monarch ruled increased, his authority within his own dominions also increased. This is Louis XII going off to assert his authority, actually not in France, but in Italy. Every extension of the king's sway intensified his dignity and lifted him higher above his subjects. Local liberties and feudal rights which checked a Duke of Brittany or a King of Aragon were much less effective against a King of France, like Francis I, or a King of Spain, who had more soldiers, higher revenues, and better credit. Feudal and local powers fought a long holding action against the crown for hundreds of years, but the tendency was against them once the king became the symbol of national unity and the center of national aspirations. And this monarch gained as much from the growth of the new ideas as he did from the decay of the old. The Renaissance, which we shall discuss in detail next time, the revived study of Roman civil law, eventually the Reformation, all of these would contribute to the growth of royal power. Even scholars who worked with their pens and who had to live on pensions contributed to it. Pensions, after all, can be more easily got from princes than from parliaments, because parliaments don't regard purely intellectual achievements as a service to the state. And so the scholars looked to the king, and the king got his reward in the praise he received from the world of letters. Helped by new benefactors, scholars and artists had the means to study the mythology, literature, and art of the Romans, and from there to rediscover the Romans' political organization and their laws, all of which had a significant effect on European thinking. Just as the classical Latin of ancient Rome seemed superior to medieval Latin, dismissed as dog Latin, so Roman imperial law seemed superior to the barbarousness of European common law and feudal custom. As scholars rediscovered Roman law, its study and application spread outward from the Italian universities, first into the lands of the Holy Roman Empire, whose emperors regarded themselves as the successors of imperial Rome, and then into the rest of Europe. So by the 15th century, the maxims of Roman law were everywhere, and our civil laws are all marked by it. Nothing could have suited the new kings better, because the old common law and feudal custom were based on local interests and constituted checks on any central power. The maxim of the Roman law, however, was that the will of the king was law, and this was a maxim that could be quoted against lords, or popes, or parliaments. There was also the Roman tradition of deifying emperors, and by the 16th century, some European courtiers were almost inclined to pay similar honors to their kings. To understand their attitude, you have to remember the misrule of the previous age, the decline and failure of the previous system, and the strength of popular demand for a firm, masterful hand at the wheel. There is a modern myth that people have always tended towards democracy, constitutions, electoral rights. But in truth, love of freedom has never been the predominant note of popular politics. At most times, popular demand has been for a strong government. The government of the kings was never good, but it seemed better, at least for a while, than the anarchy that preceded it. Authoritarian stability was better than authoritarian anarchy. The violence of an organized state was preferred to the blind violence of a disorganized feudalism. And in the 14th century, any state that could afford it had means of violence more efficient and more expensive than ever before. Strong government and capital-intensive warfare traditionally go together. That's because the power that controls the weapons can enforce its will. And the first thing it enforces is taxation to pay for more weapons. Taxation, in turn, reinforces the central authority and its bureaucracy and makes it more efficient. So the better the weapons and the military that use them, the greater the central authority's capacity to tax and control, and the stronger its growth at the expense of its subjects and of other lesser powers. The 1300s and the 1400s saw the appearance of weapons that would affect history down to our own day. Guns and gunpowder. Centuries before, the Byzantines had used Greek fire, fireballs that helped them beat off the Slavs and the Arabs. These fireballs were shot from catapults, but increasingly from tubes as well. So when the idea of guns with metal tubes reached Europe from India and China in the 13th century, there were European weapon makers who could copy them. Cannon and cannonballs made of iron or stone were useful against walls, ships, and troops in close formation. Turkish cannon battered down the walls of Constantinople in 1453. French cannon helped drive out the English at the end of the 100 Years' War. And there were also handguns. An English general was killed by a handgun in the last battle of the 100 Years' War in 1452. By the 1500s, the arquebus, the musket, the rifle came into their own and became the core weapon of modern infantry, also the key to European power beyond Europe. It would be handguns that won much of America for Spain and the East Indies for Spaniards, Portuguese, English, and Dutch. In Mexico, the guns of the Spanish were thought to produce lightning. It would be difficult for any man to stand up against controlled lightning. And so the future lay with Europe's more modern armies, equipped with artillery, like the French armies that conquered Italy after the 1490s, and equipped with handguns that won America for the Spaniards, and gave the Spanish infantry a superiority that dominated Europe into the 17th century. After all, not everybody could build a gun. You needed arsenals and expensive equipment. By the 16th century, Spain and other states were spending 2/3 of their revenue on weapons. Naturally, countries with plenty of iron ore and a superior metallurgy had a great advantage, and that meant Central Europe, France, and in due course the Swedes. The new weapons also meant that cities and feudal lords were no longer safe behind their walls. Modern warfare based on guns and gunpowder dispensed once and for all with castles, with knights in armor, and also with a culture of chivalry and the culture of independent cities. It opened the age of the modern state, interested in order, in taxes, and in strong, ever stronger institutions. So war and government and the world in general have all been transformed by gunpowder. Those of you who don't like the idea of a strong interventionist state will deplore this development, and I really see the point. But you have to remember the robber barons and the general disorder that went before. The days of Romeo and Juliet may seem romantic, but they were also days of gang warfare and terror and bloodshed. A lot of English and French and Italians were glad to see noble knights replaced by the king's peace, fragile as it was, and as it still is. Next time, the Renaissance. Until then.
Funding for this program was provided by the Annenberg CPB project.
For information about the Western Tradition television course, transcripts, pre-recorded video cassettes, off-air taping, or related books based on the television series, viewers should call the Annenberg CPB Project's 1-800-LEARNER telephone number, or write to the Annenberg CPB Project, 1111 16th Street Northwest, Washington, D.C. 20036.
Seinfeld has the hairstyle that's right for you.
I got a haircut.
Right there?
Something distinctive. Or something completely different.
You fixed me up with a bald woman.
You're rejecting somebody because they're bald.
So?
You're bald!
For hair-raising comedy 6 days a week, make an appointment with Seinfeld.
6 days a week on WDFX.
Need to see a psychiatrist? Experiencing anxiety?
What is the matter with you?
I have got
Uncontrollable outbursts? Unusual sexual urges?
You're the only man I've ever loved.
So are you.
Well, luckily, the doctor is in.
They like me. They really like me.
Get psyched for Frasier 5 times a week.
Weeknights at 10 on WDFX.
We're mad about you.
How romantic.
Just mad about you.
Tell me it's true.
It's a sure bet she's as good as it gets. I'm mad about you. So make a date with your TV.
Oh, my God.
'Cause Helen Hunt's the girl you should see on Mad About You.
Maybe.
Weekdays it's true. Watch Mad About You.
Weeknights at 9:30 on WDFX Fox 34.
The doctor is in.
Oh, a sensitive man.
Girl, you know I feel naked without my tool belt.
Powerful man.
Overton Jones has more pull than the elastic on a fat lady's draw.
I got what it takes to fix your broken heart.
Expert handyman will service your needs.
So call Overton and you can get the job done.
Living Single, now delivered 5 days a week. Weekdays at 5:30 on WDFX.
Oh, and if you told...
Welcome to the Shepards Chapel Network Family Bible Study Hour with Pastor Arnold Murray. Wisdom is understanding God's Word. Pastor Murray's unique teaching approach brings God's Word alive with meaning as he takes you on a chapter-by-chapter, verse-by-verse study of God's letter to you, the Bible. And now here is Pastor Arnold Murray.
Good day to you. God bless you. Say welcome to the Shepards Chapel. Welcome to this family Bible study hour. Last two chapters of the great book of Proverbs, the rules of life from the wise. The words of the wise, as they're gathered together and placed before us, many times if you're not careful, you begin concentrating on the wise and you forget one thing. Thus, I'm going to begin today's lecture with a word of wisdom from our Father with a verse from the book that follows Proverbs, that's to say Ecclesiastes, which tells us how to be happy in flesh bodies, how to find peace of mind in the flesh bodies while we're walking here under the sun. It's a Hebrew idiom that means exactly that. In the 12th chapter, and the 11th verse of Ecclesiastes, it reads, and listen carefully, the words of the wise are goads. Now, a goad is a nail on the end of a pole that you encourage cattle of one type or the other, okay, naturally to go in a straight path. Are goads, and as nails fastened by the masters of assemblies, which are given from one shepherd. I want to repeat the last part, are given from one shepherd, and that is the chief shepherd of all shepherds, that is to say Christ himself. So it's important that you always bear that in mind. I feel that many people, their faith weakens when they feel this master or that master, and we've only got one. It all came from one. The reason I say that, you're going to have some new names introduced today in the closing chapters. Solomon's servants. So we only have one shepherd that is the living word, and the word comes from him. Okay, enough said. Chapter 30, verse 1. Let's go with the next to the last chapter, or rather, of Proverbs. The words of Agur, I would rather translate it, I will love, meaning I will love the Father. I will love that shepherd. The son of Jacob, which is to say pious. I believe many manuscripts have the son of her that was pious. Be that as it may, the feminine I instill for the benefit of the student that wishes to go deeper. Even the prophecy, this prophecy, the man spake unto Itiel, which is to say, El is with me, that's to say God is with me, even unto Itiel and Eucol. Eucol meaning I am strong. I am a can-do type individual. Why? Because the Word of God makes us strong. Okay, with introduction, verse 2. Surely I am more brutish than any man. You could translate that, I'm a little more stupid than any man. This is as the man thinks to himself, and have not the understanding of a man. I just don't have it. I don't seem within myself to be, and this is typical of Christians. They always feel like, well, as bad as I am, God could never use me. Well, Paul thought he was pretty bad too. As a matter of fact, he helped the Coats while they murdered Stephen. And he was bad, but God still saw fit to use him. Why? He was a chosen vessel. So we leave those things in God's hands, but this is a very humbling statement for a man to make. I want to make that clear coming out the gate. In other words, he's saying, within myself, I'm just a nobody. And quite frankly, that's the way all of us are until you have knowledge concerning the Word of God, gain true wisdom, and then we realize it is God's Word that makes the difference. Okay, so he's humbling himself before God. Verse 3. I neither learned wisdom nor have the knowledge of the holy. In other words, when I began, I hadn't studied, he's saying, and I didn't have the knowledge of the all-holy. That is to say, really what wisdom is about. Verse 4, and it begins then with some questions. Listen to it. He knows now. Let me make that quite clear. So there's nothing wrong with being biblically illiterate as long as you don't stay that way. That's kind of what he's saying, okay? Verse 4, who hath ascended up into heaven or descended? Question. Well, I would say you better know of a certainty that the Lord Jesus Christ, the chief shepherd, has. Who hath gathered the wind in his fist? Question. Who can do that? The wind is ruach in the Hebrew, the spirit. Who hath bound the waters in a garment? Who set that shoreline there that the waters must stay at the coast of the lands? Who hath established all the ends of the earth? Question. Can you answer this? Of course, our Father. What is his name? And that's something you need to know. What is his name? And what is his son's name? If thou canst tell. Question, can you? Well, Moses asked him the question, who are you and who shall I say sent me? And he said, you tell them Yah sent you. And then he stated, I am that I am, which is the etymology of the sacred name, Yahweh, meaning I'll be wherever I wish to be and at what point I wish to be. I put it together. I cannot help going back to the 38th chapter of Job, where God asked Job these same questions. Job, you've been listening to these three men that are absolutely ratchet jaws. They don't know come here from Sikkim. And you've listened to them. Why don't you listen to me? And quite frankly, that's who you need to listen to, is God, or someone teaching God's word rather than a bunch of sayings of men. For there's only one shepherd. And what is his son's name? Yahweh's son's name is Yeshua, which is to say Yahweh's Savior. That's what we say in English when we say Jesus. So hopefully you can tell. You can answer the questions. It's our Father, and we certainly love him and respect him, and I shall love being the name of the speaker. Verse 5. Every word of God is pure. You need to come to that conclusion. For it is, if you go to the manuscripts, all right, he is a shield unto them that put their trust in him. You have to love him because he has put in history and in prophecy documentaries concerning the fact that his word is true, his word is pure. Once you become wise in the word, that is to say gain understanding, you're not going to find it in man's understanding or wisdom. You've got to get it from your Father, for all wisdom comes from him. And he has placed the very events that you would question here in our path through both history and the future. For if you understand his prophecies and know the future, when you see those prophecies coming to pass in this generation, monthly almost rather than yearly, I can remember when I first began studying the Word, it was about every 10 years. And now it's like labor pains of a woman as we come closer to the birth of a new age. It's important, beloved, that you realize the purity of his word that lets you know what tomorrow brings basically overall. And if you really want to prove his word pure, study to show thyself approved, and you will love him all the more. Verse 6. Add thou not unto his words, lest he reprove thee. He'll convict you, and thou be found a liar. This is why I would grow very restless if I were to put the traditions of men, as many people do, into their teachings. That is to say, words men have stated, rather than teaching God's word chapter by chapter and verse by verse. For God is not a liar, and his words are true. Men many times lie innocently in their ignorance of what they feel or have heard from other men, which is simply traditions of men that make void the Word of God. Be careful, my friend. You are living in a generation that will consummate all these events. That also is written. Have you read it? Verse 7. 2 things have I required of thee. Deny me them not before I die. In other words, don't withhold these from me. I really require them.